The culture of the Old Testament is almost entirely foreign to us. For one thing, the culture is not the same throughout the Old Testament. The primitive pre-flood culture was, very different from the Israelite monarchy later under King Solomon. The style, the way in which people lived was different. The way they related to one another was different. The number of people was different, which changes everything, of course, in those situations. Even later, when they began to develop the first efforts at centralized government with the Tower of Babel, which I think in many ways that was all about, God stomped on that, to put it mildly. He confused their languages, scattered them all over the countryside, because God did not want to see man developing a central pillar here around which everyone could rally, which would then tend to centralize their culture and the structure of mankind. But even later, when centralized governments did emerge, there were no nations as we know them. The Bible uses the term, and we casually throw the term out there. But that's not what the Bible talks about when it uses that term, because there wasn't anything like that in, I think, any time in the Old Testament, really, anything that you could call by modern definitions a nation. There were tribes. They were families grown large. When it came to something that they tend to call nations, they actually are not. They are city-states. A city-state is a city, usually a walled city, that dominates the countryside around them, and whatever reach the king or emperor of that city could reach out and command and enforce any kind of acceptation of his governance, including his taxation, his tribute, and whatever it is he could impose upon people. But it was the city, it was the governor of that city, it was the Greeks only much, much, much later who developed the polis or city-state, which was governed by the people who lived in that city. One of the most surprising things about the nation of Israel, when they conquered the land of Palestine and settled the land, is that there was no centralized government at all. That may seem strange, you've read the Bible, you have these images in your mind of what Israel was like, but you really have to go all the way back to Joshua and Judges and Samuel to see what that country was like at a certain time in its existence. And at that time in its existence, whatever government they had was entirely decentralized. Worship was centralized at the tabernacle, and that was the extent of it. The high priest who officiated there was an influential person throughout Israel, could command a lot of respect. But as far as governance, day-to-day, managing the affairs of the nation or the country, no. In fact, that does not seem to be anything that God had in his plan. What God seemed to want for man was that every man would govern himself under God, that the head of a family would govern his family under God, that the elders of a larger group of families, we would call a tribe, would exercise low-level, mild, occasional governing structures among their tribes and among their people. But it was a social structure, not a constitutional, legalized type of structure with which these people governed their affairs from day to day. They actually had centralized worship at the tabernacle in Shiloh, but otherwise it was tribes, it was elders, it was judges in cities or towns that they had at that time. I get the feeling in reading Joshua and Judges and 1 Samuel that governance was an ad hoc matter, invoked when needed for the purpose at hand. Whenever there was a criminal to be judged, they got the elders of the city together in the gates and they judged the criminal. When there was an adversary to be fought, they sent word out around the surrounding countryside, they gathered the men together, they formed their army, they fought the battle, and when the war was over, they all disbanded the army and went back home again. It was a very loose, easygoing society. When the need for an army passed, so did the army. They were an example of people very lightly governed. I don't know who it was that made the statement, he is governed best who is governed least, but this is the people of Israel. They were governed least, very lightly. Their governor, their king was God. Now, it's a marvelous system, a very desirable system for people who have the discipline to keep the faith. For people who have an internal discipline, who have a moral discipline, who have a God who imposes individual and personal standards on people to which they are committed, in which they believe in which they obey, and they have a personal covenant with God as well as their covenant with their neighbors. For those people, this is a marvelous system of government. But the problem was, even in ancient Israel, from time to time the system collapsed, and God had to send them a leader to help straighten things out, fight the battle, get things back to normal. This tended to happen when everything began to collapse, the people began to forget God, and God forgot them, and their enemies came rolling in on top of them, and then they cried out to God, and whenever they cried out to God in oppression, God sent them a leader. The leader squared it all away, and then he basically just doesn't necessarily disappear from the scene, but goes back to his oxen and to his sheep and to his home and to his family, and life returns to the old normal pace of every man sitting under his own vine, under his own fig tree, taking care of the maintenance of his house, the discipline of his children, the raising of his family. That was, I think, as far as I can read in the Bible, what God really had in mind and what he really wanted to be. The system does not seem to be ideal because it kept breaking down. And yet, it does at the same time seem to be the system that God wanted for them. The story of what happened to that system, the story of how it actually finally came to its end and evolved into a totally different system, is written down in the Bible, and I have to presume it's written down there for you and I to learn from it, to grow together lessons and life applications from it. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11, one verse, "Now all these things happened to them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come." You know, if all this stuff had just happened and it was over, that would be one thing. But it was written down. And now Paul says it was written down for a purpose. That purpose is so that you can read it, so you can learn from it, and you can be admonished from it. Now I'm going to take up the story, not in Joshua and not in Judges. I'm going to take up the story in 1 Samuel, chapter 1, verse 1, where one of the most important characters in all of Israel's history is introduced to us. There was a certain man of Ramoth Zophim, of Mount Ephraim. His name was Elkanah, and he gives us his genealogy. He had two wives. The name of the one was Hannah, the name of the other Peninnah, and Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And there's an interesting thing here about this. I don't know, you wonder sometimes why this is so. But it is all too often the childless woman that God chooses to bear the son who is going to be the key figure in the time to come. Why does he do this? You'll have to ask God that question. But he does it, and it's done often enough that you have to realize it's a pattern and it fits his character. One of the things that all of us think we'd like to know about, we'd like to know what God is like. Well, we learn these little things and all sorts of interactions and decisions that happen in the Bible that God reveals to us. This man went up every year to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. Now there's three names there: Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas. If you mark your Bible, you might mark them. They are names you should remember because they are written here for examples and for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. These fellows are not written for any kind of a good admonition. They are a bad admonition. But it is something I think that's important for us to learn. When the time that it came that Elkanah went to offer his offering, he gave to Peninnah, his wife, and all her sons and her daughters portions. Now, in case you don't understand what this means is that generally speaking, when you went up to the temple to offer your sacrifices, only small portions of the primary offerings, except for the whole burnt offering, only small portions of the animal were burnt. The remainder of it was returned to the person who sacrificed it to go have a feast. So whenever they had holy days in Jerusalem and they were sacrificing lots and lots of animals, the place was, wall to wall in fresh meat. And so people were cooking and giving out portions of food to their family. To Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. Now, this is interesting. It does say the Lord had closed her womb. Not that it just was that way, but that for his reasons he had done this. Her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. Now, all this, again, falls very strangely. I said the culture of the Old Testament is strange upon our ears. Having more than one wife is strange upon our ears, because it's very clear from the Bible that God's intention for marriage was one man, one woman, for life. And yet in the ancient world you find common examples of polygamy, and God, right in this particular case, reaches into a polygamous relationship, chooses a woman, and decides to bring on the scene through her, as I said, one of the most important men ever to come on the pages of your Old Testament. Why? do these things work this way? You also have to understand, I think, about this, the polygamy and why it may have been tolerated in Old Testament times. There was no welfare system like the one we have before. Women could not, if their marriage broke up, go out and get themselves a job. There was no, junior college they could go to get trained in computer skills, and then there was no bank they could go work for doing data entry. There was nothing like that at all in this society. And a woman kicked out of the house on the street did not have a whole lot of options besides selling her body or starving to death or whatever it is that she might have to do to keep herself alive. And so the allowance of a man to take in another wife was in its way a kind of welfare for the people concerned. The other side of the story also is that as people grew old, there was no Social Security system to help them starve with dignity in their old age. There was nothing of that sort. You depended as you got older on guess who? Your kids. Your kids. Therefore, having lots of kids was lots of security. And the more kids you had, especially since probably infant mortality was rather higher than ours is today, and because life expectancy may not have been as high as ours is today, more kids was better. Fewer kids was bad. And a woman who was not having children, no matter how much her husband loved her, was not really, in a sense, judged in that world to be carrying her weight. Her intentions were no big deal, except I think many people probably assumed that because she had no children, she was under some kind of a curse from God, or that she was a bad person. If she was a good person, God would have given her children. Well, now, in Hannah's case, we know better than that. We know she was a good woman. We know she was a godly woman, because we know ultimately that God looked upon her. I think sometimes God may close a woman's womb as much because of the relationships in the family as for any other reason. And, a lot of that is lost to us. We don't have record of why that might be. Anyway, and Elkanah went up year by year. He did all this. He came to the house of God, and he did the things he did. And her adversary, that is the wife who had children, kept provoking the wife who had no children, so that she wept, and even at a holy day and a festival could not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why are you crying? And why don't you eat? Why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 7 sons? I take care of you. I treat you good. I love you. You are my beloved wife. This other woman I've had children by, but you know that you're the wife that I love. You're the one that I want. It's sort of like Jacob and Rachel. He married Leah first because of the trickery, but the woman he loved was Rachel. But Rachel was a long time having children. It was delayed in her case as well. Well, Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh and after they had drunk, and Eli the priest was sitting on a seat by the temple of the Lord. And Hannah was in bitterness of soul, and she prayed to the Lord, and she wept sore. I don't know what, weeping sore. She must have been convulsed with grief as she wept there on her knees in that holy place. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your handmaid and remember me, I will not forget your handmaid, but will give to your handmaid a man-child. Then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. There shall no razor come upon his head. Different culture, different time. Sounds like the Nazirite vow in some ways, although that's never mentioned in this connection. It is suggested by some that the long hair is a symbol of submission. And in this case, it would be submission to God, but we're speculating on so much of that, it's almost impossible for us to know for sure. Well, it came to pass as she continued praying before the Lord, Eli noticed her lips. Hannah spoke in the heart. Her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. She was not making a sound. Only in her heart did she speak. And Eli, looking at her, thought she'd been drinking too much. And he said, how long will you be drunk? Put away your wine from you. And this coming from this particular man is particularly something. Hannah answered and said, No, my Lord, I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I haven't had any wine. I haven't had any strong drink. I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Don't count your handmaid as a daughter of worthlessness or worthless daughter. For out of the abundance of my complaint and my grief I have spoken to. And Eli, I think probably somewhat chastened, said, Go in peace. The God of Israel grant you your petition. And bad as he was as a high priest, that blessing that he gave upon her on this occasion was not only justified, it was fulfilled. And she said, Let your handmaid find grace in your sight. And she went her way and ate. and she was no more sad. Now, it's interesting. Not only, I think, do we have the faith of Hannah, but I think Hannah considered the blessing of the high priest, that him saying, God grant you your petition, was very important, because he was a man who stood in that place and spoke for God. And that answer she considered to be real. Well, they rose up in the morning early, and they worshipped before the Lord, and returned and came to their own house in Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And it came to pass, when the time came about, Hannah had conceived and bare a son, and called his name Samuel. And thus is born, as I said, one of the most important figures in all of biblical history. He will play an enormously important role in some major transitions. And she said, called him Samuel, because she said, I have asked him of the Lord. So they continued their custom, this family. They went up from year to year to worship God, to keep these holy days. And Hannah, though did not go up on these subsequent occasions, she wanted to continue keeping the child, giving him suck, until she had weaned him. Now, I have no idea at what age she finally weaned him. I'm under the impression that women nursed their children much longer in those days than they do today. It was rather some little time. But anyway, she took him up when she had weaned him, with the bullocks, an ephah of flour, a bottle of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh. The child was young. They slew a bullock and brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as my soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman that stood here praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition. Therefore have I lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord. And he, that is Samuel, worshipped the Lord there. Now, as I said, I warned you ahead of time, we really have no grasp at all of the culture of the Old Testament. We can sort of, look marginally at it. We can sort of pick around at little strings that we can find to grasp things. But it's almost incomprehensible that a woman would take a newly weaned child out of her, that she had prayed for and that her heart had broken for, and take him to Shiloh and give him to Eli. Eli was a big, fat, self-indulgent man, but he was the priest of God. And she turned this child over to the priests. Now, the three we know about, Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas, were not all that were there. There were other men there, and I have to consider they were better men than they. That there would have been at that tabernacle in Shiloh a school, without any doubt, where the languages could be learned, so the scriptures could be read, and that Samuel was brought there, and it's almost in many ways it would have been a lot like taking a young boy and taking him to a boarding school away from his family and having him again study under the tutelage of grown men, which in this particular case, that is precisely what happened. Now, there's a beautiful song of Hannah. It follows in chapter 2. I won't read all of it to you. I'll let you read it on your own. But it really is encouraging when you read it, how she comes down and says in verse 6, the Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and he brings up. The Lord makes poor, he makes rich. He brings low, he lifts up. He raises up the poor out of the dust and lifts the beggar from the dunghill and sets him among princes and makes them inherit the throne of glory. She realized that what God was doing in this particular case with her son was taking a little child from nowhere and putting him in the most important single position in all of Israel to come. I don't think she realized that yet, but this is in a sense a prophecy of what was going to happen. Because Samuel would hold the dominant position in all of Israel once Eli has died and Samuel stepped into his room in the temple of God. Really a startling thing. There are little things in this that you read along that are very touching, and some, of course, that are very sad. Verse 12 of chapter 2, the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. Actually, the word Belial means worthless. They were just worthless trash, is what these boys were. They didn't know God. They were priests in the temple, and they didn't know anything about God. The priest's custom was, with the people, that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant came while the flesh was cooking with a flesh hook of 3 teeth in his hand, and he stuck it into the pan or the kettle or the cauldron or the pot. Whatever the flesh hook brought up, the priest took for himself. That's what they did in Shiloh, where all the Israelites came. Also, they burnt the fat. The priests, before they burnt the fat, the priest's servant would come and say to the man sacrificing, give me flesh to roast for the priest, because I don't want to have it boiled. I want to have it raw so we can cook it the way we want to cook it. Well, the man making the offering said, well, let them not fail to burn the fat presently, and then take all you want. And he would answer, no, no, you will give it to me now, and if you don't give it to me, I will take it by force. Well, they wanted to have that steak with the fat around the edge of it so they could put it on there. It made a better steak. It tasted better. So they didn't want the fat cut off. They wanted the big old slab of meat so they could do it their own way. Wherefore, the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. That little statement right there, their sin was very great because they caused people to hate making an offering to God because of the way they were treated. It really underlines in many ways the responsibilities upon people who, those of us who serve as elders in God's work we're not priests by any stretch of the imagination. But it really underlines the importance of the way we treat people, because we could actually get to the place, if we abused the monies that you gave to us, if we were careless in the approach that we took, if we were dominating in our approach to you, we could get to the place to where you actually, even though you wanted to give an offering to God, you would absolutely hate to do it because it'd come into our hands. That's where they were. And I'm afraid this happens from time to time in one church or another over generations and over time, that people get to the place to where even the offering that God expects them to give, that they know they must give to God, they hate to do it because of the abuse that's going on by those who are in power in that situation. It's a very real danger in any kind of situation or structure where God is working. But Samuel, it says, ministered to the Lord, being a child, girded with a linen ephod. And the linen ephod was simply the priestly garment. Moreover, his mother made him a little coat and brought it up to him from year to year when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. That little word, that little expression in there, his mother made him a little coat, is so touching. And you realize how much her heart must have yearned on Samuel, to see the boy. And so that she would spend her time making him a little coat. And then when she would go up from year to year to keep the feast, she would see Samuel. She'd give him his little coat. She could hold him, love him, hug him, and somehow reestablish what relationship there was left of a mother. Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife and said, the Lord give you seed of this woman for the loan that is lent to the Lord. And they went home. And the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, Samuel grew up before the Lord. So God cared, and he made up for Hannah's missing son. But it takes a lot of faith, to be able to turn over a child to God that way and take your hands off. Or just take your hands off and trust God to take it where it's supposed to go and to do what's supposed to be done, especially when you know the administration is corrupt, which Hannah and Elkanah knew that. You can imagine the kind of faith this woman had. This woman deserves to have her name in the Bible. Hannah does. She is really something else. Well, Eli was very old, and he heard all that his sons did to Israel, and how they would sleep with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Now, I don't know what circumstances or how they went about it, but these guys, they were actually sleeping with the women who came up to worship God. And he said to his sons, why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil doings by all this people. What kind of a weak man is not able to deal with the problem because it is his sons? Think about that. And think about the awesome responsibility of a man in Eli's position to do what has to be done. The strange thing about this is we will see the same pattern later with Samuel's sons, only not as bad. Not quite as bad as Hophni and Phinehas, and certainly not in Samuel's case. He was not. But even Samuel was not able to manage his sons. No, my sons, he said, it's no good report I hear. You are making the Lord's people transgress. If one man sin against another, the judge will judge him. But if a man sin against the Lord, who's going to entreat for him? Notwithstanding, they wouldn't listen to the voice of their father because the Lord would slay them. Whew. You realize what's going on here? There came a point in time where God had made up his mind that he was going to kill those 2 boys. And he hardened their heart to where even though their father went to them and talked to them, they wouldn't listen because God had closed them up, had shut them up. Now, was that always true? No. When those were little toddlers walking around 3 feet high, he could talk to them. He could deal with them. He could work on them. Why can't he now? Because somewhere along the line, they passed a point where he lost his control over them. And when you don't take advantage of the time you have, with the window that you have, to train your children, to bond with your children, to teach your children, the fear of God, when you pass the time when you can do that, you may not get another shot at it. There came a point in time where these boys had sinned to such an extent that he closed their hearts to where even their father speaking to them had no effect on them whatsoever. The child Samuel grew on and was in favor with both the Lord and also with men. That's interesting. He was the one guy at the tabernacle, a boy is all he was, that people actually respected because of his faith, because of the way he carried himself, the way he conducted himself. Maybe in the course of his own sons, somebody had learned something and taught Samuel better than Eli's sons had been taught. There came a man of God to Eli. We don't even know who this fellow is. He's a man of God. I guess Eli knew he was. He came to Eli and he said, "Thus saith the Lord, did I plainly appear to the house of your father when they were in Egypt in Pharaoh's house?" He's talking about Aaron. "Didn't I plainly appear to your father? And didn't I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest and to offer upon my altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod, the priest's garment before me? And didn't I give him the house of your give to the house of your father all the offerings made by fire of the children of Israel? I did all this stuff. Didn't I do this? Why then do you kick at my sacrifice and my offering, which I have commanded in this habitation? Why do you honor your sons above me to make yourselves fat with the chief offerings?" All right, come on. I gave you this. I chose your father. I gave him all of the offerings of all these people down through the time. That wasn't good enough for you. What's the matter with you? Why was that not good enough? Why did you have to go beyond it? To kick at my offerings. What he means is just to kick dirt on them because they're not good enough for you. You have to go beyond. It really is a harsh judgment upon the man. What lesson can a person take from that? Well, the lesson is to be grateful with what God gives you, to be thankful for it, and don't go grasping at things that he has not. He then says, "Wherefore, the Lord God of Israel says, I said indeed that your house and the house of your father should walk before me forever. I did it. I said it. But now the Lord says, be that far from me. Them that honor me, I will honor, and they that despise me will be lightly esteemed." That's a marvelous little statement there. I don't know if you recognize it or not. This little quotation came out of here, was taken from here for the movie Chariots of Fire. And the one runner handed another runner a piece. The guy who refused to run on Sunday because he was trying to honor God, he handed a little slip of paper that said, "Them that honor me, I will honor." And of course, the whole story about that is the faith of a man who was willing to endure, even giving up the Olympics, if that was what he had to do, in order to do what he believed was right before God. In his case, he wouldn't run on Sunday because he believed that Sunday was the Sabbath. But this little statement, I think you need to, it might be useful to put it on the wall of your house somewhere, at least to engrave it on the walls of your heart. "Them that honor me, I will honor. Them that honor me, I will honor." I think that's an important lesson to take away. They that despise me, well, I think we have a slight euphemism here when he says they will be lightly esteemed, because it was a lot more than a loss of esteem that the sons of Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas suffered. "Behold, the days come that I will cut off your arm, the arm of your father's house. There will not be an old man in your house. Of all your kids, all your family, all your people, nobody's going to live to old age. You shall see an enemy in your habitation, in all the wealth which God will give Israel, and there shall not be an old man in your house forever. And the man of yours, whom I do not cut off from my altar, shall be to consume your eyes and grieve your heart, and all the increase of your house shall die in the flower of their age." Whew! That's rough. That is really rough. Now he goes on to talk about this. He says, this shall be a sign to you. What's going to come upon your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, in one day they shall die, both of them. And I will raise me up a faithful priest that will do according to what's in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he will walk before my anointed forever. I'll tell you, there's so many lessons to be drawn from this. One of them is, just because God has anointed you even and put you in an office does not give you immunity. You see that? Just because you have been anointed and put in office does not give you immunity. The Apostle Paul said, I keep under my body, lest after having preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. Paul knew this lesson, and he knew that he could not afford to presume upon his calling. He couldn't presume that just because God had called him and commissioned him and destined him to accomplish a great thing, he could not presume upon that to live his life any way he wanted to live. He still had to fulfill the responsibilities of his office. He still had to set a moral example for the people he worked with. And Paul went way out of his way to set an example in every possible way he could, because he knew he could not take his own situation for granted. Where you are, sitting in the very temple of God, doing what you're doing, that is the very sacrifices of God, the very ministry of God, does not give you a blank check. It doesn't buy you any cachet. If anything, you are held more to account for obedience than anyone who has not been given those responsibilities. That's the lesson that comes rolling down the pike on old Eli here. Now, what do you think about him in his last days when this man comes and gives him that? Because I have to presume he knew what the man was talking about. He's going to get another shot at it before long. But let's stop right now and ask about this one. What about Eli? Supposing at this point in time, Eli had said to himself, I have really sinned and done evil in the sight of the Lord, and humbled himself, prayed, cast himself on the ground in the dust, fasted, and asked for God's forgiveness. Do you suppose that would have made any difference? Sure. Why didn't he? Because he didn't. And this is really interesting to think about. And the reason I say this is because later in history, we will learn of a man named Ahab. Ahab has the testimony of the Bible that he was the worst of the worst. He was absolutely the worst king in all of the history of the 10 northern tribes of Israel. He and his wife, Jezebel. They were the bottom of the barrel. And so God sent a prophet along to him just like he sent this one along. And the prophet comes along and says, he that dies of you in the city, the dogs are going to eat, and the vultures are going to eat. That not a one bit of you is going to go to the grave. They're going to, you'll be dung on the field. Jezebel will be dung on the face of the field, which she was. Ahab, when he heard this, the worst of the worst, humbled himself, clothed himself in sackcloth and fasted, and went softly around the palace. I imagine it was startling to people, who were used to Ahab slamming doors and kicking people out of his way, to find him, who was that? And realize it was Ahab tiptoeing down the corridor. Now what's interesting is, God looked at that, and he said to the prophet, look at that. See what Ahab has done? I will not bring the evil in his days. In his son's days, I will bring it. And then I ask myself, well, what if his sons, having heard the same prophecy, did what Ahab did? Humbled themselves, fasted, prayed, sought God. God would say, well, look at that, how unusual this is. They too have turned around. I won't bring it in their days. And you get the impression in the Bible that after maybe 3 or 4 generations of this, that the curse would pass completely from the house of Ahab. I wonder how often in any history that has ever happened. It's rare enough for one man in a family line to repent. But see, the problem is that when he repents and God relents, his sons are apt to think that the curse was causeless or pointless in the first place, and once again begin to take God for granted. What God did with them, what God spoke to them, would be very difficult to say. Chapter 3, 1 Samuel. The child Samuel ministered to the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no open vision. I mean, one guy that came to Eli and gave him the message must have been 1 in a million. But he brought it. It came to pass at a time when Eli had laid down in his place, and his eyes were beginning to wax dim that he could not see. And ere the lamp of God went out in the temple of the Lord where the ark of the covenant was, and Samuel had laid down to sleep, that the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, Here am I. Now, what is fascinating to me about this is that Samuel was still just a boy. I don't know how long a period of time had passed, but he's still just a boy, very young. And he got this, and he ran to Eli, and he said, I'm here, you called me. And he said, I didn't call you, go lie down again. He went and lay down. The Lord called again and said, Samuel. Samuel got up, went to Eli, because he thought Eli was the one calling him. He's the only one there. And he said, Here am I, you did call me. He said, I didn't call you, my son, go lie down again. Samuel did not know the Lord yet. Isn't that interesting? Samuel did not know the Lord. Now, he knew about God, surely. He was being taught the Scriptures, I'm sure, in this place, but he really did not know God. Neither was the word of the Lord yet revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel again the third time, and he arose and went to Eli and says, Here I am, for you did call me. He's getting a little impatient. And Eli finally realizes that the Lord had called the child. And Eli said to Samuel, Go lie down, and it shall be if he call you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. And Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood and called as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And though Samuel answered, Speak, for your servant hears. And of all the people around that God might have spoken to, he chose a boy, Samuel, son of Hannah, the wife of Elkanah. And the Lord said to Samuel, Behold, I will do a thing in Israel at which the ears of everyone that hears it shall tingle. In that day I will perform against Eli everything I have said concerning his house. When I get started on this, I will make an end. Once the ball goes, nothing's going to stop it until it goes completely through and finishes everything I said that I was going to do. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity that he knows. It isn't something he doesn't know. It's not something he isn't aware of. He knows it because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them. Now, I can only conclude that it was within Eli's grasp to restrain those boys. It was within his grasp to throw them out into the street if he had chosen to do so, and I have little doubt he would have had no trouble finding men to help him do it. Do you, considering the way they'd been treating people? No trouble whatsoever in throwing them out in the street, banning them from the tabernacle, allowing them not anywhere in the precincts of Shiloh. He could have done it. He didn't. Why didn't he? They were his sons. To me there is a bond between fathers and sons, and it causes fathers and sons to do stupid things sometimes. But again, God held him accountable for not restraining his boys. He was responsible. Therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be purged with sacrifice forever. There's nothing you can do. It's too late now. It's over. And that's another lesson that I think everybody needs to realize. God is merciful, compassionate, great, awesome in his willingness, but there is for every man a point of no return. You can provoke God and provoke God and provoke God, and there does come a place when there is no way back. Proverbs says, He who being often reproved hardens his neck shall in the end be suddenly destroyed, and that without remedy. It's not as though the first reproof. It's the frequent, often, continual reproof of God. There does come a point of no return. Now, you ought to write that down in your memory. You ought to actually engrave it on your heart and never let yourself get away with it, because the rebukes of God come into our lives from time to time in surprising ways, and we need to listen. Because if you don't listen, sooner or later, there comes a time when the opportunity for change is past forever. And there are a lot of examples of it in the Bible. Here is only one. One of the interesting examples, which I'll be developing in the broadcast series I'm doing now on Jeremiah, is the fact that Israel had numerous chances to repent and turn things around. Then they had a chance to repent and go into captivity and live through it. And then finally there was a period of time when they could not even do that. They were going to die. It was an interesting progression that goes on all through the ministry of Jeremiah as he prophesies, warns, and then finally it is forever too late. Samuel lay until the morning, and he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and he was really afraid to tell Eli the vision. I would have been too. Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. He said, Here I am. He said, What is the thing that the Lord has said to you? I pray you, hide it not from me. God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of what the Lord has said to you. So Samuel told him every whit. Didn't hide a word from him. And he said, it's the Lord. Let him do what seems to him good. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him. And this is interesting. He did let none of his words fall to the ground. Not a word that Samuel said was allowed to fall to the ground. It's a figure of speech, obviously, but it tells you that he backed Samuel up on everything Samuel said. And so he grew, and from it, all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again in Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself in Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Now that's an awkward construction under normal circumstances. Normally you would expect him to say, the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh. Why did it add this, by the word of the Lord? Well, what I think simply is that the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh as the Word. That one that we find in John 1, chapter 1, that says the Word, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So you begin to understand fairly quickly who it was that Samuel was dealing with, who it was that spoke to him in the night, who it was that did not let one word of his fall to the ground. The Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. And then, of course, comes some interesting byplay having to do with the battles with the Philistine, the Ark of the Covenant, the taking of the Ark of the Covenant, and then its return. And I don't want to spend a lot of time with that because there's another point that I'd like to make in the remaining time. It's found in 1 Samuel chapter 8. It came to pass, when Samuel was old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, the name of his second Abiah, and they were judges in Beersheba. And his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after lucre and took bribes and perverted judgment. So even a man like Samuel can have sons go bad on him. There's something also I think that's important for us to understand, that young people have minds of their own. I'm fully persuaded a parent can do everything right, and a child still goes sour. I don't know what parent there is that will ever say I did everything right, and really, in the night speaking to themselves will say I did everything right. I don't know any parent that would ever do that. But the fact of the matter is I think you could do everything right and your child still has the opportunity to go south on you. I think one of the big lessons to be learned from both Eli and from Samuel is, though, that while you have the time and while you have the chance, you'd better bring these children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord from the time, so that when they never remember a time in their life when they did not know about God and about Jesus Christ. They did not know that Jesus loved them. They did not know that God cared about them. They did not know that there was a God who created man and who had a way of life that was good for them. They would never remember a time in their life when they did not know these things, because you have taught them from the beginning to know God. This is something that parents can do, and I think it's one of the great lessons that we can take away from this. But here's a great man of God, and his sons turned aside, took bribes, actually, and perverted judgment. They were actually sitting in judgment before people who came before them with a lawsuit, and they took money under the table and decided for the person who gave them the money. It's inexcusable. They were the sons of Samuel. Well, the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel to Ramah and said, look, you're old, your sons aren't going your way. Make us a king to judge us like all the nations. Now, this had never happened before. And they had never had any. The other nations around them all over the place had kings. Israel did not. And like I told you, they seemed to be very lightly governed people. Government only impinged on their lives when it was absolutely necessary to do so. And even then, it was mostly voluntary. The call went out, the trumpet was blown. We got to have every able-bodied man down here to go fight the enemy. Well, they came. And they fought. And they worked their way through the challenges of life again and again. But as time went by, they got tired. They got tired. And one of the things that I began to realize as I read this and thought about it is that there is a fatigue that comes in upon a people from time to time. Because walking in God's way requires some effort. It requires some sacrifice. You've got to make good decisions. You've got to set examples. And there does come a time when the burdens of freedom become heavy and people start thinking in terms of laying them down. And the end result of this, it has been throughout history in every civilization known to man, and finally including Israel, was They decided they wanted a centralized governmental structure so that they would not have any problems with, they'd have a standing army, they could have a government that controlled things, that told people what to do and when to do them and where to do them. They actually began to give up control of their lives and the responsibility for the control of their lives in order to have some comfort, some safety, and that they wouldn't have to decide on it themselves. They began to lay their freedom down. And I think it is as consistent a pattern, because it is in human nature, that once we start getting tired, once we start feeling threatened, then we are willing to lay down freedoms in order to have safety. We would like, we won't take care of ourselves. We won't pay our own medical bills. We want the government to pay our medical bills. And the whole thing about it is that basically it's us paying them in the long run anyway. But my point is simply this, that a people who gradually over time become demoralized and who begin to degenerate in their self-indulgence, their willingness to fight their own battles, to struggle their way through, to suffer the results of their own mistakes, when people get to the place to where they don't want to do that anymore, they start wanting government to solve the problem for them. And here I think, if you just think about what we've got here, what is God's will? I think we have a clear example in the Bible that it was God's will that every man be governed by, govern himself, govern his own family under God, and that their relationship to one another in worship, while that would be centralized in the tabernacle, they would all worship the same God, and they would all worship the same God in the same way, that each man would govern his own affairs. Each man would avenge his own murders as far as that's concerned. That's an interesting story all by itself. But the whole question of how little townships and cities were governed, how they handled their crimes, how they did all these things is an interesting study all by itself. It was all decentralized in the beginning, and that seems to be the way God wanted it to be. Because now here's what happens. When the thing displeased Samuel, when they said, "Give us a king to judge us," and Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people and all they say to you, for they have not rejected you, they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." Bottom line is, God was their king. They just had a hard time trusting God when he was out of sight. That was their problem. And he says they didn't reject you. And Samuel, of course, his initial idea was it was a personal rejection, I guess, but God says, no, that's not what's going on here. According to all the works that they have done since I brought them up out of the land of Egypt to this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, they're doing exactly the same thing to you that they've done to me all through the years. So go ahead, listen to their voice, but I want you to do one thing. I want you to protest solemnly to them and show them precisely what this king is going to do to them. And boy, the list that follows of what the kings were going to do to them. Actually, it seems kind of light by modern standards, because they said the king was going to take 10% of everything they had. Nowadays, it runs up to 35 and 40, nearly 40% for some taxpayers that they're going to come in and take of the stuff that you take in. But, he said he's going to take 10%. And another thing you have to understand is that up until this time, while the people tithed, and the tithe belonged to Levi, there was no internal revenue service. People gave the tithe. Tithe was not exacted from them by somebody coming around on a horse and with a sword in his hand demanding that they pay up or else. And with some accountants coming by and doing audits of how many cows they had this year. Nothing like that existed. A man out of his own heart to worship God, paid his tithes, gave his first fruits, gave his offerings, and did all the things he was supposed to do to God. Now he says, they're going to take it from you. There will be an internal revenue service. There will be audits. There will be people who come around and attach your property. They'll take part of your vineyards. They'll take away some of the stuff that you want, that you'd like to keep for yourself. They're going to do all these things. That's what your government's going to cost you. You can't have this government you want for nothing. I think they probably thought they could. But that was the lesson that God gave them. Now, I could go on in the section of Samuel, but I think time will run out. I recommend it to you for a read. But I want to tell you what I think we need to take away from this. It's not just a simple statement that decentralized is better than centralized governance. It's a little more complicated than that. In fact, I think what God wants each of us to do is to be self-governed under God. And that self-government under God, we come together in our communities whereby we join ourselves voluntarily together to serve God, to worship God, that these are things we do communally together that require a very light hand, where governance is concerned, and where maximum freedom to serve God, worship God, do works for God, to praise God is given to all of us that can possibly be done. And it's only when we become demoralized, when we ourselves begin to lose our focus, when we begin to lose our energy, that we tend to look around for somebody else to do it for us. And we might begin to think in terms of we would like to have some sort of an organizational structure, to be part of a larger church organization with a centralized organization somewhere else that can kind of give us some direction and can kind of show us the way we're supposed to go. You know, leadership is crucial, because the Bible does say that the children of Israel followed God all the days of Joshua and the elders that overlived Joshua. That kind of leadership made an enormous difference in Israel. But that was leadership. What we're talking about now, and what we tend to get out of when we begin to centralize our operations, and I've been through the organizations, I know what I'm talking about, is we tend to get control. And we wind up finding people telling us again and again what we can and can't do, setting down policies that might seem good enough in Chicago, but really aren't really good policies for Tyler. You know, it's like having a single minimum wage for all over the country. I mean, who in New York City earns minimum wage? You know, it's a silly thing to even talk about in a way. But the idea is that Congress in Washington will set a minimum wage that applies in every city in the country where costs of living vary wildly from city to city. The same thing is true in a church. That if you're going to have any kind of a centralized service organization for a church, it needs to allow maximum freedom for the people so that they can do what God leads them to do. They can follow the leadership of the Holy Spirit, so the Spirit can move in random ways as it chooses throughout the church to accomplish the work of God. Lightly governed. They who are governed best, who are governed least, is one of the great lessons I take away from Samuel. And I think it's really crucial. Several things. One, teach your children while you have time. Second, carry your responsibilities. Because if you don't carry your responsibilities before God, somebody else will carry them, and you will be sorry. Some important lessons from the history of God's people.